Death. Watching Nigerian soldiers from the 81st West African Division advance through bamboo so thick it blocks out the sky. Japanese machine guns open up from concealed bunkers. Men fall, others keep moving forward, not charging heroically but advancing with methodical precision through terrain that would break most formations. Hamilton has served with British units, seen Indian divisions fight, watched Gurkha battalions earn their legendary reputation. But these West African troopsmen, his fellow officers, dismissed as primitive colonial auxiliaries, are accomplishing what the previous campaign failed to do with 3 times the casualties. They're carrying 40-pound loads on their heads through jungle that has no roads, no vehicle tracks, no mule trails. They're outflanking Japanese positions that were considered impregnable. And in that mud-soaked moment, Hamilton realizes something that will haunt him for decades. These men will bleed for an empire that will never remember them. Before we march deeper into this forgotten campaign, if this story of erasure and injustice resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe to ensure more untold histories reach the light. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from, whether London or Lagos, Accra or Atlanta. These stories belong to all of us who refuse to let sacrifice be forgotten simply because it was inconvenient to remember. History isn't just what we choose to celebrate, it's also what we choose to bury. 1943. West Africa, Nigeria, Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Gambia. The Royal West African Frontier Force has served as Britain's colonial garrison for decades. Border guards, police units, peacekeepers, maintaining order across territories stretching from Atlantic coast deep into African interior. These aren't combat formations built to fight modern mechanized warfare. They're constabulary troops, most of whom have never heard shots fired in anger, never trained for offensive operations, never imagined fighting in distant jungles against an enemy 8,000 miles away. Then Japan smashes into Burma. By May 1942, Britain has suffered its worst military disaster in living memory. Singapore fallen with 85,000 troops surrendered. Burma lost in humiliating retreat. India threatened. The British Empire faces existential collapse in Asia, and Churchill needs troops, hundreds of thousands of them. The decision comes from London with bureaucratic efficiency. Form 2 full infantry divisions from West Africa, ship them to Burma, throw them into jungle warfare against Japanese forces that haven't lost a battle in 18 months. The 81st West African Division organizes in 1943. The 82nd West African Division, formed earlier in 1941, prepares for overseas deployment. Each division contains roughly 23,000 personnel. Most are Nigerian, with battalions from Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Gambia. British officers command at senior levels. African soldiers fill the ranks, but these divisions differ fundamentally from anything else in the British Army. Each includes thousands of unarmed carriers, African men who transport supplies by headload through terrain where vehicles cannot go and mules cannot survive. British commanders look at this system with barely concealed contempt. They call it primitive, inefficient, a wasteful deployment of manpower better used elsewhere. They see African soldiers and assume inferiority before a single shot is fired. Field Marshal William Slim writes in private correspondence that West African troops have an unnecessarily generous supply of British officers, and that their horde of unarmed porters represents questionable military value. General Philip Christison, commanding 15th Corps, calls the carrier system a fatal weakness. These are the men who will decide how West African divisions are deployed, how they're supplied, how they're remembered. The assumption is clear as morning fog. West Africans can hold quiet sectors, maybe patrol empty jungle, but real fighting against the Japanese that requires Indian troops, Gurkhas, British battalions, not Africans. The 81st Division ships to India in late 1943. After brief training that barely familiarizes them with terrain and tactics, they receive orders for their first operation, the Caladan Valley. This isn't a prestigious assignment. The Caladan runs parallel to the main Arakan front, but separated by 6,000-foot mountains. No roads, no supply lines. Just jungle so thick you advance single file through bamboo walls that close behind you like prison doors. The mission sounds simple on paper. Advance down the valley, tie down Japanese forces, prevent them reinforcing the main battle. But simplicity on maps becomes nightmare in execution. Major General Woolner commands the 81st Division. He has never led troops in combat. He doesn't understand the terrain. He doesn't respect his soldiers. In December 1943, he sends his brigades forward into catastrophe. British intelligence fails completely. The Japanese 54th Division is far stronger than estimated, well supplied, dug into prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. Woolner's brigades advance in single file along narrow tracks, perfect targets for ambush. Supply by airdrop fails repeatedly. Troops go days without food. The monsoon turns every stream into a torrent that drowns men trying to ford. Malaria devastates companies faster than combat. The division suffers over 1,300 casualties. Not from brilliant Japanese tactics alone, from incompetent British command, from inadequate intelligence, from contempt that sent African soldiers into impossible missions without proper support, without realistic objectives, without leadership that valued their lives. Woolner is relieved of command. The division withdraws in disorder. And in London, in Delhi, in the officers' clubs where British commanders gather over gin, the verdict comes swift as judgment. West African troops cannot fight. The experiment has failed. Ship them to garrison duty. Use proper soldiers for real combat. Except that verdict ignores what actually happened. British officers who served at company level tell a different story, one that never reaches official reports. The troops fought well when given clear orders and proper support. They didn't break under fire. They didn't panic when ambushed. Their casualties came from impossible missions and failed logistics, not from cowardice or incompetence. Lieutenant Hamilton watches African soldiers march 20 miles through jungle in a day carrying full kit. He sees them dig defensive positions in ground so hard it breaks entrenching tools. He watches them carry wounded comrades for miles to evacuation points, never leaving anyone behind, maintaining discipline under fire that would scatter green troops. But Hamilton is a junior officer. His observations don't reach the ears that matter. The narrative sets like concrete. West African troops have failed their first test. The blame falls on the soldiers, not the commanders who sent them to slaughter. History is being written in real time, and it's being written wrong. Then something changes. Major General Frederick Loftus-Tottenham takes command of the 81st Division in mid-1944. Loftus-Tottenham is a former Gurkha officer, but unlike Slim, he doesn't worship only the martial races of India. He looks at his West African battalions with fresh eyes and sees what others missed. These men have acquired thorough working knowledge of modern arms and equipment, learning in a foreign language, adapting to conditions utterly unlike their homeland. They're not stupid. They've been poorly led. He spends months retraining the division, not because the soldiers are inadequate, but because British command failed them. He ensures clear orders, reliable air supply, realistic objectives, and, crucially, he learns to use the carrier system as an advantage rather than treating it as a weakness. September 1944, the 81st Division returns to the Caledon Valley. Same terrain, same Japanese opponent. Different leadership. This is the second Caledon campaign, and it will vindicate everything Loftus-Tottenham believes about his soldiers. The division advances with 3 brigade groups spread across 60 miles of jungle front. The Japanese expect another stumbling advance in single-file easy targets for prepared ambushes. Instead, the West African brigades use their carriers to outflank prepared positions. They move through terrain the Japanese assumed was impassable. They establish supply dumps by airdrop, then advance for weeks without resupply, living on what their carriers haul forward on their heads through mud and monsoon. The Japanese 54th and 55th Divisions fight with their customary determination. They've held this valley for 2 years. They know every ridge, every stream crossing, every killing ground. But they cannot pin down an enemy that refuses to advance on predictable routes. The West African battalions flow around strong points like water, finding channels appearing where Japanese commanders thought no force could approach. They use terrain that maps mark as impassable. They sustain operations where logistics should collapse. The sound of mortar echoes through valleys where only bird calls should exist. Smoke from Japanese positions drifts through canopy like fog that never lifts. By January 1945, the 81st Division has cleared the greater part of the Caledon Valley. They've outmaneuvered Japanese forces, who outnumber them in certain sectors. They've accomplished in 4 months what the previous campaign failed to do in 6. The casualties tell the story with mathematical precision. 438 men killed or wounded. 1/3 the losses of the first campaign. Same valley, same enemy. Competent leadership and proper employment of African soldiers unique capabilities made the difference. General Oliver Lees sends an official dispatch praising the 81st Division. They have shown outstanding ability to endure terrible conditions of terrain and climate. Lord Mountbatten congratulates them personally. Your division has established a reputation which will always be remembered in the annals of the Burma campaign. That promise will prove cruelly, devastatingly false. Within 2 years, the forgetting will begin. Within a decade, the erasure will be nearly complete. While the 81st Division fights in the Caladan, the 82nd West African Division enters the 3rd Arakan campaign. This is a much larger Operation 15th Corps pushing down the Mayu Peninsula, forcing Japanese evacuation from territory they've held since 1942. The 82nd Division draws some of the hardest missions. Their brigades must advance through coastal swamps and dense jungle, cut Japanese supply lines, seize key terrain that commands the approaches. The fighting is brutal in ways that statistics cannot capture. Japanese forces defend every position with the determination of men who know surrender isn't an option. They have no supply lines to retreat along, no reinforcements coming. They fight because their code demands it, and they die in bunkers that become their tombs. The 82nd Division attacks fortified positions where machine guns cover every approach. They wade through swamps chest deep in water that hides leeches and disease. They climb mountain ridges so steep that men haul each other up by rope, gasping in humidity that makes every breath feel like drowning. The division's 3 brigades cover between 274 and 428 miles on foot during the campaign. These aren't road marches with rest stops. This is jungle warfare, where 5 miles in a day represents major advance. They fight through monsoon season when most operations halt. They sustain themselves entirely by airdrop for months. Their carriers haul ammunition forward through terrain, where a single false step means sliding down a cliff to death in the canopy below. When the campaign ends, casualty reports reach headquarters with cold bureaucratic precision. The numbers tell a story that should shake British command. 82nd West African Division, 285 casualties. 25th Indian Division, 285 casualties. 26th Indian Division, 606 casualties. The 82nd Division and 25th Indian Division tied for the highest casualties in 15th Corps. Not because they fought poorly, because they fought constantly. Because British command sent them into the hardest missions. Because they advanced when other formations paused to regroup. Because they died doing exactly what was asked of them. 285 casualties. The number deserves repetition because it represents something British command never expected. African soldiers, many barely 20 years old, most from villages that never knew modern warfare. I had attacking Japanese bunkers and swamps where corpses sank into mud within hours. They died from diseases that turned healthy men into skeletons in 3 weeks. They died far from home in a war most had never heard of before joining the army. They bled the same red as any British Tommy, any Indian sepoy, any Gurkha rifleman. But when victory came, their blood would not earn them the same remembrance. The carrier system that British generals mocked proved decisive in ways that shatter preconceptions. West African divisions could operate for months without vehicle transport. They could advance through terrain marked impossible on maps. They could outflank prepared Japanese positions because their supply line wasn't a road vulnerable to interdiction. It was 400 men carrying 40-pound loads on their heads, moving where trucks couldn't go, where mules couldn't survive, where conventional logistics collapsed into uselessness. Brigadier Swinton assessed after the campaign that the West African soldier was the only soldier among all the different nationalities from which the British Army in Burma was drawn who was capable of operating for months on end in the worst country in the world without vehicles and without mules. Not the bravest, not the most skilled, but the only one who could sustain operations in terrain that broke logistics for every other formation. In jungle warfare, heroism means nothing if you can't get ammunition forward, can't evacuate wounded, can't feed your troops. Most divisions in Burma depended on roads or mule tracks. When monsoon washed away tracks and turned roads to rivers of mud, operations halted. West African divisions kept moving. That capability should have earned them recognition proportional to their unique contribution. Instead, it earned them erasure. 1946, London. Field Marshal William Slim sits at his desk, writing what will become the most celebrated memoir of the Burma campaign. Defeat into Victory will tell the story of how Britain's 14th Army transformed disaster into triumph, how they drove the Japanese from Burma in history's largest land battle against Japan. Slim commands every detail with meticulous precision, every division, every battle, every sacrifice that shaped victory. But as his pen moves across pages that will be read by thousands, studied at Sandhurst, cited by historians for decades, Slim makes a choice that will define how an entire campaign is remembered. 90,000 West Africans, roughly 1/6 of 14th Army's frontline strength at its peak, will not appear in his memoir. 1/6 of his combat forces erased, not because they failed, not because they fled, but because acknowledging them complicates the narrative Slim wants to tell. The 81st and 82nd West African Divisions fought in Burma's most brutal campaigns. They bled in the Caledon Valley. They died in the Arakan. The 82nd Division tied for the highest casualties of any unit in 15th Corps. They pioneered air supply operations. They marched further, carried more, endured conditions that broke other formations, and Slim writes 600 pages without mentioning them once. This isn't oversight. Slim is meticulous. He remembers divisional commanders, brigade actions, battalion sacrifices. He praises his Indian divisions. He lionizes his Gurkha battalions. He acknowledges British troops, Chinese allies, American air support. He simply decides that West African contributions don't merit mention in his story of victory. Why? Historians suggest several reasons, none flattering. Slim rose through the Indian Army and maintained lifelong loyalty to formations that matched his background. West Africans were outsiders, colonial forces he never fully accepted. His private correspondence reveals contempt for the carrier system, skepticism about West African capabilities, frustration with the First Caledon Campaign without acknowledging the command failures that caused disaster. But there's likely an uglier truth: racial attitudes that pervaded British military culture. The assumption that some soldiers, some races simply mattered more than others. When writing history, Slim has the power to shape memory. He chooses to erase 90,000 men rather than acknowledge they were underestimated, rather than admit their success challenges his assumptions, rather than give them space in a narrative he wants to reserve for formations he personally values. The consequences ripple forward like stones thrown into still water. Defeat into victory becomes the standard reference for the Burma campaign. Historians cite Slim's memoir as authoritative source. When they write about 14th Army, they follow Slim's narrative. West African divisions aren't important to the story. They become footnotes. Then they vanish entirely. Louis Allen writes, Burma, the longest war in 1984 definitive military history based on extensive archival research. Allen mentions the 81st Division exactly once and gets the name wrong, calling them the 81st East African Division. 600 pages of detailed military history and West African troops merit one incorrect reference. This is how history dies. Not through dramatic suppression, not through burning archives, but through quiet decisions by commanders and historians about whose stories matter. Slim decides African soldiers don't merit mention. Historians follow his lead. Publishers prioritize books about Gurkhas and Chindits and British heroes. And within 20 years of war's end, the West African story has nearly vanished from British memory. The 82nd Division tied for the highest casualties in 15th Corps during the Third Arakan Campaign. This isn't a minor statistic. It means West African troops bore one of the heaviest burdens of fighting in that sector, paid a terrible price, yet post-war histories treat them as supporting players at best, invisible at worst. Historical memory failed West Africa's Burma veterans for 5 intertwined reasons. First, literacy. Most West African soldiers left no written record, no letters, diaries, or memoirs, so their voices vanished from the archival record. Second, photography. The 81st Division had no official photographer in the First Caledon Campaign, leaving visual memory dominated by British and Indian troops. Third, decolonization. Burma's 1948 independence ended British interest in commemorating the campaign, and African contributions disappeared with it. Fourth, institutional racism. British military culture praised martial races like Gurkhas and Indian units, while dismissing West Africans as incapable despite their proven performance. And fifth, Field Marshal Slim's silence. By omitting 90,000 West Africans from his memoir, he signaled to future historians that they did not matter. Yet these troops achieved extraordinary results. They made up 1/6 of 14th Army's frontline strength, endured heavy casualties, excelled in jungle mobility, and completed major operations with determination and resilience. Their accomplishments live in war diaries and official reports if Britain chose to forget them. The remedy is simple: restore them to the story. In museums, histories, classrooms, and commemorations, remember the 90,000 West African soldiers who fought, bled, and were unjustly erased.